Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we are going to break down AWS Credentials. This is an absolutely critical topic for any developer working with AWS, and especially if you're studying for that AWS Certified Developer exam. So, here's our game plan. We're going to start with the foundational idea of the credential chain. Then, we'll get into the specific order AWS looks for those credentials. After that, we'll cover some more advanced stuff like profiles and assuming roles, and we'll wrap up with how to fix things when they, inevitably go wrong. Okay, let's dive right in. Have you ever wondered how your application or your script just magically finds and uses your AWS credentials? You don't hard code them, or at least you shouldn't. So how does it just know? Well, it's not magic. It's a really smart, logical process called the credential provider chain. It's standardized across pretty much all the AWS SDKs. And here's the golden rule, the most important thing to remember. The very moment the SDK finds valid credentials, the search stops. It doesn't keep looking. That single principle is the key to understanding everything else we're about to talk about.
All right, here's a classic exam question for you. Picture this. You're deploying your application to an EC2 instance. Security is everything, so hard coding keys is a huge no-no. What's the best practice here?
The answer, and you will absolutely see this on the exam, is to use an IAM role. The AWS SDK is smart enough to check something called the Instance Metadata Service. Think of it as a secure little web server that lives on a special IP address on the EC2 instance itself. This service hands out temporary, auto-rotated credentials. It is, without a doubt, the most secure and recommended way to handle credentials for any app running on EC2. Okay, so we know the SDK goes on a hunt for credentials. But what happens if you have keys hiding in more than one place? Who wins that fight? This brings us to the order of precedence. Nailing this down is super important, not just for building stuff, but for passing that exam. So take a look at this. This is the pecking order. This is the default chain for most SDKs, and you can see it starts with the most specific thing, environment variables, and works its way down to the most general, which in this case is the EC2 role. This hierarchy is everything. So this question gets right to the heart of that hierarchy. If you've got keys set as environment variables, and you have keys in your credentials file, which one does the SDK actually use? And the answer is a big, resounding yes. Environment variables always win. You can think of them as the ultimate override. If they're set, the SDK finds them first, stops searching, and completely ignores the credentials file. Okay, let's bring this back to your own machine. You're coding away locally, you're not on an EC2 instance, you haven't set any environment variables. Where on earth are your keys supposed to live? The SDK has a go-to spot it's programmed to look for. It's a file called Credentials, located inside a hidden folder in your home directory called .aws. That full path, /.aws/credentials, is the industry standard place to store your access key ID and secret access key for local development. All right, let's level up. What happens when you're working with multiple AWS accounts, or maybe different roles for dev, test, and prod? You need to start juggling multiple identities, and that's where profiles come in. This is absolutely essential stuff for real-world work. Now, this is so important, and it's a classic gotcha that trips up so many people. You have two files, credentials and config. The credentials file is for your secrets, your actual keys. The config file is for everything else, non-sensitive stuff like your default region, and crucially for defining roles. And look closely at the naming difference. In the config file, you have to put the word profile before the name. It's a small detail that causes big headaches if you forget it.
So you've set up all these different profiles for your different accounts. That's great. But how do you actually tell the CLI or the SDK which one to use?
That's where this little flag comes in, -profile. Think of it like a channel selector on your TV. By default, you're on the default channel, but this flag lets you switch to any other named profile you've configured. It tells the SDK, hey, for this command, go look up the settings for this specific profile. And this is where it gets really powerful. You can use one profile with your permanent user keys to temporarily assume a role, maybe in a completely different AWS account. You set up your source keys, then you define another profile in the config file that points to that source and specifies the role you want to assume. When you use that role profile, the SDK automatically makes the STS assume role call behind the scenes for you. It's an incredibly powerful and secure pattern.
In a perfect world, everything just works the first time. But, well, we don't live in a perfect world, right? So let's talk about some of the most common errors you'll hit and, more importantly, how to fix them. If you see this error, unable to locate credentials, it's basically the SDK throwing its hands up in the air and saying, I give up. It means it went through that entire provider chain we talked about. It checked environment variables, it looked for the files, it checked the EC2 metadata service, and it came up completely empty. Okay, now for one of the most confusing and frustrating errors you'll ever see. Invalid signature exception. Your keys are perfect, your permissions are right, everything seems correct, but it still fails. What is going on? And the culprit, believe it or not, is probably the clock on your computer. I'm not kidding. AWS is incredibly strict about time. Every single API request is signed with a timestamp, and that request is only valid for a very short window. If your machine's clock is drifted, even by just a few minutes, the signature it generates is considered stale and invalid. So, first step, check your clock. When you are well and truly stuck, when nothing makes sense, there is one command line flag that is your absolute best friend. It's your secret weapon. That secret weapon is -debug. Using this with any AWS CLI command just opens up the fire hose of information. For debugging credential issues, it is a goldmine. You'll literally see it print out things like looking for credentials via env, not found. Looking for credentials via shared credentials file, found credentials. It shows you exactly what the SDK is thinking, step by step. So we've gone through the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of how AWS credentials work, but that brings up a much bigger question, doesn't it? It's not just about making it work, it's about doing it the right way, the secure way. So always ask yourself, are you choosing the most secure option available, like an IAM role, over a less secure one, like long-term access keys? Because making security your default choice is the real goal here.